We have intended, then, to say that all our intuition is nothing but a representation of phenomena, that the things which we intuit are not in themselves the same as our representations of them in intuition, nor are their relations in themselves so constituted as they appear to us, and that if we take away the subject, or even only the subjective constitution of our senses in general, then not only the nature and relations of objects in space and time, but even space and time themselves disappear, and that these, as phenomena, cannot exist in themselves but only in us. But maybe the nature of objects considered as things in themselves, and without reference to the receptivity of our sensibility, is quite unknown to us. We know nothing more than our mode of perceiving them, which is peculiar to us and which, though not of necessity pertaining to every animated being, is so to the whole human race. With this alone we have to do. Space and time are the pure forms thereof, sensation the matter. The former alone can be cognized a priori, that is, antecedent to all actual perception, and for this reason such cognition is called pure intuition. The latter is that in our cognition which is called cognition a posteriori, that is, empirical intuition. The former appertain absolutely and necessarily to our sensibility, of whatsoever kind our sensations may be. The latter may be of very diversified character. Supposing that we should carry our empirical intuition even to the very highest degree of clearness, we should not thereby advance one step nearer to a knowledge of the constitution of objects as things in themselves. For we could only, at best, arrive at a complete cognition of our own mode of intuition, that is, of our sensibility, and this always under the conditions originally attaching to the subject, namely, the conditions of space and time. While the question what are objects considered as things in themselves remains unanswerable even after the most thorough examination of the phenomenal world. Immanuel Kant. To fully understand the critical project, it is important to understand one more distinction Kant makes, and that is the distinction between sensuality and thinking or intellectuality. That, of course, unlike the one between analytic and synthetic judgments, that, of course, is a distinction that existed before Kant already, that existed even in antiquity. But it had not been correctly defined before. Just like in previous cases, I can point back to my lecture on what is philosophy. Just like in the case of the distinction between theoretical and practical philosophy, or the distinction between philosophy in general and mathematics, what Kant is doing is he is coming up with a new and with a better distinction that is based on principles. So that is a true distinction because it deduces the two things it wants to distinguish from two completely different principles. So it shows that they are distinguished even down to their roots. While the distinctions that were made before Kant don't distinguish by principles, but only by outer appearance. Because the Leibniz-wolffian school that was prominent in 18th century Germany before Kant, they distinguished sensuality and intellectuality the way Leibniz had done, by basically saying that sensuality is a more unclear form of cognition than thinking. So the difference between the two is in the level of clarity. So one example would be if you look at the night sky and if you look at the Milky Way, what you will see is, well, this milky white cloud, so to say, on the night sky. Or, well, at least that was true in the days of Leibniz or Kant. Nowadays, light pollution is so bad that at least in most places, at least in the cities, what you will see is basically nothing. What you will see is 3 stars maybe, and 2 of them will be airplanes. But anyways, you see this white cloud, this nebula of light. But if you think about it, about what the Milky Way is, then you know that, well, it is a galaxy made up of many, many stars, many distinct stars. And therefore, the central image or the central representation is less clear than the concept you are thinking. Or likewise, if you look at your own hand, you will not see each individual cell that the hand is made out of. And you will also not see each individual atom that the cells of your skin are made out of. So what you are seeing is basically just an aggregate of billions up in trillions, up in myriads of atoms forming myriads of cells. You are just seeing the aggregate, the whole, the hand. But when you think about it, you know that the hand is made up of cells and those are made up of atoms. So that would be the distinction as Leibniz makes it. Saying sensuality is less clear. Intellectuality means having a more clear cognition of that same object. But that, Kant says, is a completely wrong distinction. For one, where's the line? So at what level of clarity does sensual perception turn into intellectual thinking? Or the other way around. At what level of unclarity does my thinking turn into sensual perception? Also, this would basically mean that when I take off my glasses, because now my cognition is much, much less clear. Like, seriously, my eyes, I'm basically half blind. I have a mole's eyes, basically. But I don't feel like I have just become dumber by taking my glasses off. My seeing is less clear now, but my thinking is not less clear. This distinction that Leibniz does, Kant would say, basically denies that sensuality and intellectuality, that perceiving and thinking are really two different things and two different modes of cognition. It means basically claiming that they are just different degrees of the same thing. But Kant says something being clear or unclear has nothing to do with it being sensual or intellectual. Clarity and unclarity can happen in both cases. So you can have ideas, like the idea Kant says of a right, of justice, or the idea of the beautiful, that clearly are not sensual things. They are things you are thinking, but still they can be very unclear. And they are very unclear in the minds of most common people. Most people only have a very vague idea of justice. They don't really know what they are thinking when they are thinking justice. And on the other hand, something sensual can be very clear. You can look at something and maybe you have very sharp eyes and maybe the object is very near to you, then maybe you see it very clearly and you spot all the little details, but still what you're doing is seeing, not thinking the object. Kant uses the example of a house being seen by a cultured person and a savage. And both, when they approach the house, they have a sensation. And maybe the savage sees it more clearly than the cultured person. Maybe the cultured person only sees the house from afar and he can't make out how many windows there are or what name is written at the door or whatever. While maybe the savage is standing right in front of the house and can very clearly see all of the details. But then when it comes to thinking, Kant says, the cultured person thinks very clearly because he has a clear concept of what a house is. He knows that this is a building built by humans to be lived in, to be a home. While the savage, no matter how clearly he sees the house, no matter how clear his sensation of the house is, doesn't actually know what he's dealing with because he has no concept of a house. He's not really thinking anything when looking at a house, or rather, maybe he's thinking, what is this? But he is not thinking of a house because he doesn't know what a house is. He doesn't live in houses. Of course, once again, the critical method demands that you don't just disprove a wrong opinion. You can only be truly sure that it is wrong when you can also explain how someone could come to hold that wrong opinion. And that should especially be true if that someone is such a great thinker as Leibniz. Well, the explanation Kant gives is that the explanation Kant gives is that most concepts, like the concept of a house or of a tree or whatever, are empirical concepts. So they are concepts based on sensations, based on sensuality. So we first saw or heard or smelled or felt or tasted something, and then we formed the concept of that. And here sensuality comes first, and no matter how clear the sensuality is, the thinking that is connected to that sensuality and based on that sensuality is at first unclear. Like, imagine an archaeologist digging up some object. Maybe he sees it very clearly because he's holding it in his hand, but he's not thinking it clearly at first. He doesn't yet know what the object is. He doesn't know, is it a tool, is it a weapon, was it used for ritual purposes? And Kant says that maybe this, so the fact that whatever comes into our thoughts through the senses is as a thought at first unclear. Not as a sensual perception, but as a thought. Yeah, I mean, I can go back to the example of the Milky Way. People didn't always know that it is made up of many, many stars. So they had the sensual perception of it long before they came to have a clear concept of it. And that is, Kant says, what made the leibniz-wolffian school believe that sensuality is just a less clear form of cognition. But no, he says, it is an entirely different form of cognition. And the difference between clarity or unclarity of a cognition is merely a formal difference. It therefore belongs into logic, he says. But the difference between sensuality and intellectual is a material difference. The distinction that Kant makes between the two is that he says sensuality is the faculty of receptiveness, while intellectuality is the faculty of spontaneity. Now, in nowadays language, the word spontaneous has lost its higher philosophical meaning, and it is just used to describe something that happens suddenly. So, for example, when I don't know, when suddenly the phone rings and my friends call me and ask me if I want to go out with them, and I say yes, then we would call that a spontaneous decision. Or if I say no, then maybe they will tell me you need to be more spontaneous. But that is not what spontaneous actually means, because it actually means that you are not, and your actions are not caused by something else. Rather, you are the first principle of a new line of causes. When my friends ask me to go out with them and I say yes, then maybe that wasn't planned in advance by me. Maybe I said yes and decided to go out only in that second. But it probably still wasn't spontaneous. It probably still had its causes. My friends calling me, me being in the mood for seeing my friends. What spontaneous actually means in the strict philosophical sense is something being completely self-caused, having no cause coming before it, no matter how much in advance or not. So being unprompted, so to say. Kant translates the word spontaneity into German as Selbsttätigkeit, which, if in turn I want to translate it into English, I would probably translate with self-activity. So selbst means self, and Tätigkeit comes from tun, which is to do something. It has the same root as the English verb to do. So Selbsttätigkeit is self-doingness, so to say, so self-activity. So that means the sensual is the faculty of receptiveness. So whenever I am passive, so to say, whenever I am receptive of something, then that is sensuality. So, for example, when I look at my t-shirt, I see red. I receive this sensation of redness. Or if I cut myself or if I burn myself, I feel pain. I receive this painful feeling. And this is something I can't prevent or turn off. Like, if you look at my t-shirt, you have to see red, whether you like it or not. And on the other hand, if you don't look at something red, then you can't see red, whether you like it or not. Of course, you can close your eyes or you can look somewhere else, but as long as you look at something red, you will see red. And on the other hand, intellectuality means you are spontaneous. So you're not passive, you are active. You think of something, you think of an object. It doesn't have to be caused by something outside of you. I can now think of, I don't know, a dog, even though there is no dog here. I have no sense impressions of a dog right now, but I can think of the concept of a dog. And so therefore, this is intellectual, this is thinking, and not sensation. So Kant would say that sensuality gives us objects only the way they appear to us, only the way we are affected by the objects, while in intellectuality we think the objects as they are. So, for example, when I walk down the street, all the buildings I see, I only see their front. If you think about it, there are probably very few buildings you ever saw from the inside. I mean, probably your own house, maybe the house of some friends of yours. But you've probably seen a lot more buildings from just the outside than from the inside. Now, if we just went by our sensuality, there would be no reason when we go down a street to assume that the houses we see even have an inside, that they even have rooms and so on, because we don't see those. But when we think of the concept of a house, then we are not just thinking of the part of the house that currently affects us, that currently affects our senses, but rather we are thinking of what a house is, and then we will think that houses usually have rooms. Or when you look at humans, you are not seeing their inside, you are not seeing their organs, their skeleton. As far as your senses tell you, maybe all the humans you meet are empty. Maybe you yourself are empty. I don't know about you, but I never saw my own brain. So when I just go by what I saw, I don't know that I even have a brain. I don't know that anyone has brains, because if I think about it, I don't think I ever saw a human brain. I probably saw fake brains in movies. I probably saw images of brains in anatomy books. But I don't think I ever saw a real brain. So just from my sensuality, I don't know that humans have brains. But when I think about what a human is, my concept of a human includes humans having internal organs, including a brain. So once again, sensuality means receptiveness. It means we are passive, and it gives us the objects only as they appear to us, only insofar as they affect our senses. And intellectuality means being spontaneous, being self-active. It means thinking the objects even beyond how they affect us. Well, and this difference between sensuality and intellectuality leads Kant to make a distinction between two kinds of objects. That is sensual objects and supersensual objects. Now here too, you must abstract from the associations you might have based on common day language. By supersensual objects, Kant doesn't mean things like magic or ghosts or whatever. In fact, those would be sensual objects if they existed. I mean, if someone is doing magic, if someone is throwing a fireball, like in some fantasy movie, or if there's a ghost and you see the ghost, or you hear the ghost howling and rattling with some chains, then those are very much sensual perceptions. Then that magic or that ghost are clearly affecting your senses, and you are clearly receiving sensual data from them. Now, the cause of these sensual phenomena, the cause might maybe be supersensual. Maybe God made a miracle happen, but the miracle itself is a sensual thing. So that is why it is important to not confuse supersensual with supernatural. Supernatural would be things like miracles or magic or ghosts, because they go beyond or above the laws of nature, but they might still be very much sensual. The supersensual is that which is not sensual at all, meaning it doesn't affect you in a sensual way. You don't receive any data from it. It doesn't. It can't be perceived. You can think of it, like for example, justice, the good, the moral law, God, freedom. Those are things that you can think, but you can't ever possibly perceive them. So Kant speaks of two kinds of things, and he calls them appearances and the thing in itself. So sensuality gives us appearances, it gives us the things as they appear to us. And with our intellect, on the other hand, we can think of the things as they are in themselves. So we can think of things as they are independent of our perception of them, independent of the way they affect us. Kant also sometimes gives the names in Latin or more often in Greek. So he sometimes calls the things as they appear to us the sensibilia, or also the phenomena. And on the other hand, he sometimes calls the things as they are the intelligiblia or the noumena. But no matter what they are called, what he means is, on the one hand, you have the object as it affects you, as you receive sensations from it. And on the other hand, you have the object as it is independent of the way it affects you. And so you have the object as you can maybe think it, but not experience it. And I will stress that this can be one and the same object. So behind every appearance, Kant would say, there is a thing in itself, right? Behind every phenomenon that appears to you, there is a noumenon that causes that phenomenon. But that noumenon, as the name noumenon or intelligiblia implies, that noumenon can only be thought of, it can only be conceived of, but it cannot be sensed, it cannot be perceived. It is important when talking about the thing as it appears to us to stress that by this, Kant doesn't mean that this thing is just an illusion. Appearance and illusion are two very different things to Kant. He doesn't mean to say that the things that appear to us are not truly real, that they are just imagined, that they are just hallucinations of sorts. No. He says that the things that appear to our senses are real, but they are only real as appearances. So we know them not as they are in themselves. We don't know what they are independent of the way they affect us, but rather we know them only insofar as they affect us. The thing in itself, as the name already implies, is independent of us and therefore can be thought of, but can never be perceived. And with these two kinds of things also come two worlds, because to Kant the word world doesn't just mean the earth or whatever, rather world to him means the whole of all the things that are connected with each other. And that means that there are two worlds. There is a sensual world that we can experience, the mundus phenomenon, as he calls it. And on the other hand, there is an intelligible world that we can think of, but that we can't perceive, and that he calls the mundus noumenon. One could argue that this whole distinction between sensuality and intellectuality, as basically passivity and activity, and therefore between the sensual phenomena and supersensual noumena, that this marks the beginning of the critical philosophy. In his inaugural dissertation that he gave in 1770, and that can be considered the first critical writing, Kant is talking about this very distinction and introducing it. And as I talked about in my lecture on Kant's life, after this dissertation, he went silent for over a decade and more thoroughly sorted out his thoughts before then publishing his Critique of Pure Reason. And once again, I have to say, even if Kant had done nothing else but come up with this distinction, he would be one of the most important philosophers. It really can't be overstated how important that distinction is. Kant himself says that metaphysics is the science of rising from the sensual, that would be physics or natural science, the science of nature, rising from the sensual to the supersensual, to things like the soul, God, freedom. The supersensual that must be behind the sensual, because once again, the sensual is just an appearance of the thing in itself. So there must, Kant says, when there is something that appears to us, that affects us in a certain way, there must be a thing in itself that does affect us, that appears to us. Well, if metaphysics is the science of the supersensual, or of rising up from sensuality to supersensuality, then the distinction between sensuality and supersensuality should be the basis of doing metaphysics. And Kant does say that this would have been the first step, the first progress to come up with a proper definition of what a supersensual thing is even supposed to be. But even that one single step had not been done previously to Kant. He was the first to come up with a clear definition of that. And that is really immensely important. And with that, Kant is at the end of a long development. And for us nowadays, we sometimes take parts of this development, even though it is by no means at an end, if you look around at how people are thinking. But still, we take parts of this development for granted, and we also often retro-project the results of that development into the past. We don't realize that the distinction between the sensual and the supersensual is something that humans first had to sort out. I mean, you only have to look at old myths, and you will find that they don't so clearly distinguish between this life and the afterlife. So people like Odysseus or like Orpheus, they can go and find the entrance to the underworld, to the realm of the dead, and they can go there and talk to the dead while they themselves are still alive. Or someone like Yehoshua ben Levi can trick the angel of death, who shows him the walls of the paradise, and he can basically climb over those walls and get in there while he is still alive. You, for the longest time, did not necessarily have such a clear distinction between this earth and the underworld, but also heaven. Like if you read about someone being taken up into heaven, someone like Enoch, for example, in the Bible, you can probably think of that in a more literal sense, as him really being raised up. Or someone like Paul in the New Testament, when he rises into the third heaven. There really was this thought, this concept of the world, of the earth being in the center and the planets revolving around the earth, but not in the way that we nowadays think of the earth revolving around the sun. So it wasn't some vast empty space, but rather there were these different heavens with the different planets, with first the moon and then the other planets, all the way up to the last planet, to Saturn, and then beyond that, first the stars, and then beyond that, the empyreum, the heaven of God, so to say. And if you read, for example, Dante's Divine Comedy, he is rising up through those heavens. He is passing the planets as he is getting further outside and closer to God. And it is a fairly recent and fairly modern development to think of the afterlife, to think of heaven or hell as these other realms, these other dimensions. And the same when it comes to the soul, or to a person living on. For probably the longest time in history, that is not necessarily how people viewed death and what happened after death. It was a long development to come up with this concept of an immaterial soul. I mean, as recent as the time of Jesus, and if you consider the whole development of humanity, then 200 years ago is almost nothing. As recent as the time of Jesus, there was not necessarily the same conception of the soul that you would probably have nowadays. So in the Old Testament, the old Jews didn't necessarily believe in life after death. There you have this concept of God breathing life into Adam after making him from the earth, from the clay. And it is this breath which animates. I mean, the word spirit, of course, that is not Hebrew, that is Latin, but it is a concept you find through various cultures. The word spirit more or less means the same thing. It means an air and wind, something that maybe is breathed into you, and when you die and you give your last breath, that leaves you, and this life force is then gone. It doesn't necessarily exist on. And even when concepts of living on after death arose, they were often very much material. Even the first Christians didn't necessarily believe of some heaven somewhere else, but more or less an actual bodily resurrection and living here on this earth again, in a transformed earth, in a better earth, in a paradise on earth, but still on this earth, in an earthly body. The fact that there was a development that we are largely not aware of nowadays causes a lot of misunderstandings. The unaufklärt people tend to always be prisoners of their moment, and they tend to always have a hard time to imagine change. They only really believe in being, not in change. And therefore, when people nowadays read, for example, the Bible, they tend to read it as if it was written yesterday. So they tend to read the words in the Bible as having the meaning that they have nowadays. they don't realize that words over time change their meaning, that the concepts that are connected to those words change, and that what someone like Paul meant 200 years ago when talking about the soul, talking about spirit, is not necessarily the same that we mean today. In those days, the soul could still be thought of as material, probably made up of a very fine, ethereal material, finer even than air, but still material, being different from, let's say, a rock in degree, but not so much in actual quality. And you can find this in the New Testament, for example, when the Sadducees, who didn't believe in life after death, when they attack Jesus, and one of their arguments is that they say, imagine there's a woman who is widowed and she remarries and her new husband dies and she remarries again and so on. And in the end, she has had 7 husbands, and then she also dies. And then, as you say, all 8 of these people are resurrected by God. Then which of these 7 husbands is she now married to? And this speaks to a very materialist conception of what this resurrection means. They really thought of this as the material bodies coming back to life and basically leading the same life as before. And then, of course, there would be the question, which of these 7 men is now this woman's husband? But of course, what Jesus is replying is that this new life will be entirely different, and there won't be these husbands and wives as in this life. But clearly, not all the Christians got that message, because if you look into the first centuries, the church fathers, they actually had serious discussions about such questions as what happens if someone cuts off your hand at sea and throws your hand into the ocean, and then some fish eats your hand, and then later someone catches that fish and eats the fish. And then you and that person who ate the fish, you both die, and at the end of days, you are both resurrected. What happens with the matter that your hand was made out of? Does it belong to your body now or to the other's body? Because when the fish swallowed and digested the hand, it literally became part of its body, right? It was transformed into cells of the fish body. And then when that other guy caught and ate the fish, that same material was digested by his body and became part of the material of his body. So they discussed who would it belong to now. And of course, that is a question that can only arise when you have a very materialistic conception of this resurrection. If you don't really think the supersensual as truly supersensual, but only as sensual. And even nowadays, you find people being unable to make that distinction. I mean, I have talked to Mohammedan kids telling me that paradise will be so great because you will get anything you wish for. You can drive in a Lamborghini, you can fly around like Superman, you can turn into water. I didn't quite get why anyone would want to turn into water, but this is, of course, an entirely sensual conception of paradise, as if paradise was just a better version of this world, and you could enjoy there all the things that you want to enjoy in this world. This is not, of course, what actual serious religious thinkers, including in Islam, including people like Rumi or Ibn Arabi, what their idea of paradise was. The idea of all serious religious thinkers of paradise, of heaven, was, of course, always being connected to God, being close to God, even becoming one with God, melting into God. This conception that these kids have is ultimately an atheist conception, if you ask me, because clearly they are idolizing objects like a car. They want to derive pleasure from a car. That means that to them, the car is basically the idol, and there is no real God. Because if you really were connected with God, nothing else would matter to you. I mean, how could you care for having a car if you are one with God? Or I heard a story of a Christian woman whose husband had died many years or even decades ago, and now she was an old woman and was close to dying too, and she became sad and worried, and when asked why, she said that she was worried that when she would die and go to heaven and be reunited with her husband, he would not recognize her anymore because she had grown so old. And this too is a very silly, a very sensual conception of the afterlife, thinking that this body of hers that has grown old and that can be recognized or maybe not recognized because it changed too much through the way it looks, this is what she will retain. So it was a very long progress. It was a huge struggle for human thinking that went on for centuries and millennia, and that went on far longer than most would think. A development that wasn't done by the days of Jesus, and that for many people isn't even done nowadays. But this was one of the biggest and most important struggles of the human mind, and it is one of the greatest accomplishments and the greatest progresses that we managed, or Kant managed, to truly make a distinction between the sensual that affects us, that we are passive to, that appears to us, and the supersensual that exists in itself and that we can only think but not perceive. For that reason, Kant is at the same time the culmination of a long progress and struggle in the history of humanity and of a very long development, and the beginning of a new chapter. And I don't believe it to be a coincidence that this culmination, this turning of pages, happened in the age of Aufklärung of all times. Because rising from the sensual to the supersensual, that is what Aufklärung is all about. Of course, nowadays we have a much more superficial conception of Aufklärung. Nowadays people think, oh, Aufklärung, it's about being a bit critical, thinking for yourself a bit, letting go of some prejudices, not following the church anymore, and that's it. But actual Aufklärung, if you actually deal with what the actual Aufklärers wrote and cared about, was much deeper. Yes, it is about thinking for yourself, but that exactly is the reason why it is about rising to the supersensual. Because it means not only being independent of the leadership of other people, of other humans telling us what to think, it also means rising above the leadership of your senses. Once again, in sensuality, you are passive. You are just like the animals, being affected by something outside of you and reacting to something outside of you. Aufklärung means rising to spontaneity, to true freedom. It means leading yourself, thinking for yourself, and therefore rising above that which you can see or feel or taste, to that which you can only think of, and only when you decide to think of it for yourself. And this whole distinction that Kant makes here is so important, because with this, a lot of errors and mistakes in the history of philosophy can be dealt with and can be explained. And again, the critical method, which I addressed in a previous lecture, demands just that. It demands that you not just refute a position you disagree with and give arguments why it is wrong, but rather you must also explain how, despite it being wrong, it could seem right to the people who held that position. And that is what Kant now can do. He, of course, mainly deals with Leibniz, since the leibniz-wolffian philosophy was the reigning school of philosophy in his day. And there are many examples. I don't want to get into all of them, because then I would have to go into Leibniz philosophy. And I mean, I'm here already spending more than enough time trying to explain Kant's philosophy. But I want to give one example at least, and I'm on purpose going with a smaller, maybe not so significant example, and that is the law of the identity of the indistinguishable. That is a law that Leibniz established, saying that when two things cannot be distinguished from one another, so when they have the same definition, when they have the same attributes, they are identical. They are in fact one and the same thing. And this is a principle that, as a logical principle, so as a principle of thinking, is undoubtedly true. So if, for example, you think of a right triangle with the sides A 4 centimeter and B 5 centimeter, and now I ask you to think of a second right triangle with the sides A 4 centimeter and B 5 centimeter, then really you have not thought of two different triangles, you have thought of one and the same triangle. And they will have the same attributes. For example, in both cases, the third side will be 6.4 centimeters. The thing is that Leibniz applied this law even to the sensual world. The example he gives is leaves on a tree. And indeed, you can search through a whole wood, you will probably not find two different leaves that look exactly the same. And to that, Leibniz would say that is how it has to be, because if they were exactly the same in every small detail, they would not be two different leaves, they would be one and the same leaf. For them to be different, they need to have some different attributes. And the same, to be sure, might be true of even smaller things, like snowflakes. When you look at various snowflakes, each of them has their own shape. But still, Kant says there is no reason why this principle has to be true in the sensual realm. We can think, Kant says, of, for example, 2 drops of water that are absolutely identical, or 2 cubic foot of air that are absolutely identical. Now, of course, in actual nature, we will probably not find 2 identical drops of water. They will probably not be absolutely pure water, but they will probably contain some other substances, and they will probably contain a slightly different amount of it. Or if we go down to the atomic level, the 2 drops will probably not be made up of exactly the same amount of atoms. But at least we can imagine 2 drops of water that are completely identical, that are completely indistinguishable, but still are 2 completely different drops of water because they occupy different places in space, or because they exist in different times. And if anything, the scientific advancements we made since Leibniz and Kant seems to give further weight to Kant. Kant already says that it is absurd to suppose that God would have to make every single particle in the universe different and distinguishable from every other particle. And nowadays, since we have atoms and electrons, we can really say that, of course, different atoms, they might be different. They have a different number of electrons or of protons. So there's a clear difference between, I don't know, a hydrogen atom and a gold atom. But when I look at the smaller particles, when I look at the electrons, 2 electrons can be the same in their attributes. They can be indistinguishable from one another, and yet still that doesn't mean that there's only one electron in the whole universe and that all the different electrons are really one, but rather they are still different because they exist at different parts of this universe, at different places in space. So what Kant is arguing against Leibniz is that this law of the identity of the indistinguishable is true only in as much as our thinking, as our intellectuality is concerned. Because when it comes to concepts, to what I think of an object, then I can say if I think the same 2 times, then I've really thought of the identical thing. So, for example, when I think of water, I'm not talking about water as it sensually appears to me, but just thinking of the concept of water. And now I think of water again. I've really thought of the same thing. Water is water. It is defined by certain attributes. It turns to ice by 0 degrees. It turns to steam at 100 degrees. It has the formula, the molecule has the formula H2O. That is what I think when I think water. Or when I think of a dog, and then again I think of a dog, I've thought the same thing. I think a mammal with 4 legs that is domesticated by humans and so on. But then, when I am in the realm of the sensual, it is not just about how things are defined. It is not just about their attributes, but rather it is about how they appear to me. And all things that sensually appear to me must appear to me, Kant says, I will talk about this further in an upcoming lecture, but they all must appear to me in space and time. Those are the two forms of our sensuality. So if I have two different drops of water or two different dogs or whatever, even if they looked exactly identical, they would still probably appear to me from different angles. Maybe I would see one to my right and the other to my left. Or they would appear to me at different times. Maybe I have one dog in front of me now, and then that dog dies, and 30 years later I see a dog that looks exactly the same. The difference in how they appear to me, the difference in time and space alone, is enough to say that they are not identical, that they are not the same object. The same is even true for the triangle. I can say that the triangle in itself, the triangle as I think it, with the sides of 4 and 5 and 6.4 centimeters, for example, is identical with itself. But if I draw that triangle, if I draw it one time on a sheet of paper, and then, for example, another time I draw that same triangle into the sand, then those are two different appearances of the same thing in itself, of the same triangle. So that means that this principle of Leibniz, this law of the identity of the indistinguishable, is not true for the sensual realm, but Kant says it still holds true for the intellectual realm. So therefore I could argue, for example, there can only be one God, because if I think of a being that is almighty, all-knowing, eternal, holy, good, and so on, and then I think of another being that is almighty and eternal and holy and so on, then I have really thought of the same being. So there can only be one such God, because this God is not a sensual object that can appear to me in various sensual ways. He is a noumenon. He is something that I can only think of, and when I think of him, I only always think the same thing. I might add that, by the way, the same is true for the eye. Of course, in the sensual realm, there are millions of different eyes of different human beings who all say I to themselves, who all have a self, and they are all different. They appear in different ways. They have different attributes, different personalities. But if I just think of what an I, what a self is, self-consciousness, subject objectivity, as Fichte puts it. So a thing that at the same time is subject and object, a thing that can be its own object, that can as a subject think, but that can think itself, so that can be its own object. When I just think of this concept of an I always think the same thing. An I is an I. Me saying I to myself and another human being saying I to himself or to herself is really the same thing. So that would mean that differences between us are also just differences in the sensual realm, Fichte would say. If we think of ourselves in the supersensual realm, there is no way to distinguish the different humans from one another. And incidentally, that is something you will find in many religious and many mystical traditions. Whether it is the Bible saying that God made man, God made Adam, and Adam just means man, as man and woman. And then you have traditions, Kabbalistic traditions, interpreting that as meaning Adam Kadmon, so the original Adam, who is not identical with the specific individual named Adam, but rather who is humanity as a whole, male and female both. Or whether you have someone like the Insan al-Kabir, the great man in Islam, and the Quran saying that God made us humans from one soul originally, or whether you have similar ideas in India, there is again and again this idea of all of us, all our souls coming from one. And I might add, this goes beyond Kant, this goes into Fichte's philosophy, which I would like to explain at some future point, but not here. But I might add that Fichte shows that the reason that we can distinguish various different I's, different selves in this sensual world is that we have different moral duties. Every single human being has his own task here on this earth, and that alone is what makes you this single individual human being and what makes you different from others who have another task. So that is also why it is just silly or not really possible to deny morality, to deny the moral law, because Fichte can very clearly show that if there was no such thing as a moral law, if we had no duties at all, we would not conceive of each other as different persons. We would all be one and the same person then. But again, that goes beyond Kant. So back to Kant, this distinction, as I said, between the sensual and the supersensual solves or explains many debates in the history of philosophy. Kant himself mainly deals with Leibniz, but it can also be applied to other instances. So, for example, if we go back to the Middle Ages, one of the biggest, of the most important debates there was that between the realists and the nominalists. And the debate was about whether a concept like the human is something that really exists, as the realist said, or it is merely a name, as the nominalist said. So the nominalists would say that the human doesn't really exist. There only exist various humans, like me or you or this person or that person. And human is just a name we give to the sum of all of them. While the realists would say that no, human and other such things like animal or tree or whatever, house or so, they have an existence of their own. Well, in these conflicts, like in so many others, Kant's sympathetic method can be applied. We can assume that both sides, since they were honest and sincere and very sharp minds on both sides have a point, both sides are correct from a certain perspective, and we would have to combine both of them and come to assert to a more whole perspective. And Kant would say we can do that once we realize that the nominalists are talking of the sensual. And of course, in the sensual world, there is no human. There are only the various humans as individuals, while the realists are talking of the supersensual world. And of course, there we have this conception of the human. Or if we go even further back to antiquity, we have someone like Heraclitus saying that everything flows, everything is in constant movement and change. There is no such thing as being, because everything constantly evolves and changes. He famously said a man cannot step into the same river twice, because it's neither the same man nor the same river. And then on the other hand, you have Parmenides claiming on the opposite, there is no change, there is no movement, there is only being. Well, here too you can say both are right. Heraclitus is right as far as the sensual realm is concerned. Here, all being, all things remaining the same is just an illusion. There is no such thing as being. Even things that appear to remain the same, they change, maybe in small ways that we can't immediately see, but they change. At every moment, my body is changing. A small hair may fall out, a new cell may grow. But then on the other hand, if we consider things intellectually, then there is no change. So, for example, when I think of water, now actual water as it appears in sensuality can change. It can, for example, turn from fluid water into ice or into steam. But my concept of water, what I think when I think water, thinking, for example, that it is H2O, thinking that it can transmit electricity and so on, that doesn't change. The sort of water always stays the same, even if in the sensual realm all water disappeared forever, even if all water evaporated because the sun turned so hot. I would still think, I wouldn't think anything anymore, because I would be dead if all the water was gone, but that's abstract from that. I would still think of water in the same way. So the concept of water doesn't change. And so here you can see, these were just a few examples. I could go through the whole history of philosophy now, but then I wouldn't be talking about Kant anymore. I would be talking about other philosophers. But hopefully this at least gives you a sense of how Kant's critique really is the propedeutics for all philosophy, how really it is the key to understanding all other philosophical schools and theories, to understanding them better than they understood themselves. And that is why I can't stress often enough that anyone who wants to systematically study philosophy should start with Kant and should build a fundament with Kant. Unfortunately, that's not done. We live in a time of eclecticism and relativism, and we lack any sort of structure. And if you study now at university, you can, at least that is how it works here, you can more or less study the various things in any way you want. You pick some random lectures and seminars, classes based on maybe what you're interested in, or which professor you like, or maybe just on which time suits your schedule best. And it is entirely possible to go through studying philosophology for years without ever really dealing with Kant. I already mentioned that I only at university only really read one small essay and one small book of Kant's and a few pages of the Critique of Pure Reason. And even that I could have avoided probably if I had picked other classes. But if this studying is ever to become more systematic and more serious and more scientific, then it should start with teaching the students a proper understanding of Kant first, because that is the basis for understanding everything else. Now, Kant's critical project was about seeing if and how metaphysics is possible. And metaphysics, of course, as I already said, is the science of the supersensual. Natural science deals with the sensible world, the world as it appears to us. But metaphysics deals with the intelligible world, the world of the noumena, the world as it is in itself. And here you could easily make the mistake and think that this corresponds to the judgments a priori and a posteriori. So you could think that judgments a posteriori are judgments about the sensible world, and judgments a priori are judgments about the intelligible world. But of this statement, only the first half would be true. Yes, judgments a posteriori, since that basically means empirical judgments, judgments based on experience, of course, can only tell us something about, well, the realm of experience, not the realm beyond all experience. But then on the other hand, judgments a priori, they can apply to both worlds. They are not exclusive to the intelligible world. So let's turn to the analytic judgments again. When you analyze the concept of a body and you say that a body is an extended thing, that is a priori because it's not based on experience, but it is a judgment about a thing which you can experience. In fact, extension, as it happens in space, which is a form of sensual viewing, is something that can only be in the realm of experience. Bodies cannot exist in the supersensual world because that world is not spatial. It has no extensions. Or when you make the analytic judgment that a father is a man with at least one child, clearly man or parents are not metaphysical objects. I mean, I'm reminded that when I studied here in Berlin, at one time there was a class on feminist metaphysics. So maybe these people know more than I do. Maybe men are physical, but women are somehow a metaphysical thing, so there can be feminist metaphysics. But then again, maybe not. Maybe this just is another example of the sorry state of current philosophy, where people are not really knowing what they are doing, where everything is infested by ideology and by mere opinions, by mere philosophy. But people lack clear concepts, a clear fundament, clear distinctions to even know what metaphysics, for example, means. But anyway, I just want to point out that not all judgments a priori are judgments about the supersensual, the intelligible. And it is precisely the question that Kant tries to answer in his critical project when he asks how are synthetic judgments a priori possible. If such judgments are possible only of sensual objects or also of supersensual objects. And I will talk about this further in future lectures, but to spoil right away, he will basically come to the conclusion that we can only make judgments a priori of objects that exist in our experience, of objects that we can have, that we can be essentially affected by, but we cannot make judgments a priori at least no synthetical judgments a priori, of completely supersensual objects like God or the soul. So that means that if you go back to my video, what is metaphysics? That means that applied metaphysics, rational physics, rational psychology is possible, but pure metaphysics, rational theology and transcendental cosmology, that is not possible. But anyways, that I will talk about further in future lectures. For this lecture, what is left for me to do is to explain the further structure or the further split of the critique. And here we have to look at Kant's concept of the human mind. The word he uses in German is Gemüt, which is a bit hard to translate. It could mean mind or psyche, or also the sum of all our moods, which is literally where the Gemüt comes from. But I will go with translating it as mind. And what Kant says is that the human mind has three parts, three faculties. It has the faculty of cognition. It has the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. In German, Kant says Gefühl der Lust und Unlust. And I mean, lust is basically lust, but even though the words sound the same and have the same origin, the English word has a more narrow meaning. Like in English, lust sounds much more passionate, or it has much more strong sexual connotations, while in German it's more neutral, more general. I mean, it can be applied to sexuality, but it is more of good feeling in general. So I can also ask a friend, for example, hast du Lust, einen Film zu schauen? So that literally means, do you have lust, or are you lusting for watching a movie? But of course, in English, when you say lusting for something, again, that sounds sexual. This German sentence simply means, would you like watching a movie? Are you in the mood for watching a movie? So this German Lust, it means more pleasure or enjoyment in general. So hence I am translating Gefühl der Lust und Unlust as a feeling of pleasure and displeasure. And then the third faculty is the faculty of desiring. So to Kant, all acts of our psyche, so to say, come down to either cognition, that is saying that something is or isn't the case, or to feeling good or feeling bad in some way, or finally to wanting or not wanting something. And therefore our judgments can also be split up into three sorts of judgments. That is logical judgments, and here logical doesn't just refer to the formal science of logic, but rather logical judgments are all judgments about truth, about something being true or not being true. Then there are aesthetical judgments, and nowadays aesthetics is usually applied to the question of beauty and to the question of art. That is something that actually started in Kant's day in the 18th century, but Kant criticized that use of the word aesthetics, and he uses it with a broader meaning. To him, aesthetics is everything pertaining to intuition, to viewing, to feeling. So an aesthetic judgment would be a judgment saying, I like this, I dislike this. This pleases me, this displeases me. So an aesthetic judgment would be any judgment saying, this is pleasurable or this is painful in some way. And then third, there are practical judgments. That are judgments saying that we should or that we shouldn't do something. These three parts of our mind build on each other, Kant says. So the faculty of cognition is the basis, so to say, because we can have cognitions without feeling any pleasure or displeasure, or without wanting anything. For example, when you make a mathematical calculation, you're probably pretty passionless. But then when it comes to feeling, Kant would say, we cannot feel pleasure or displeasure without also having some sort of cognition. Like when something hurts you, you don't just feel pain, you also have a sort of understanding that there must be something causing that pain. You can, however, Kant says, have pleasure or displeasure without wanting anything. That is, in fact, he says, what happens when you enjoy beauty. The pleasure at the beautiful is just contemplative. So that also means that to Kant, a beautiful person is not the same as an attractive person. When I say someone is attractive, I want something. I probably want to have sex with them. But if I say they are beautiful, I just enjoy looking at them without wanting necessarily to do anything. I will talk more about Kant's philosophy of the beautiful in future lectures. And then finally, when it comes to the faculty of desiring, Kant would say that it always has to come with some sort of cognition and some sort of feeling of pleasure or displeasure. So when I want something, that wanting is connected with probably feeling good when I have it, and feeling bad when I don't have it, and that wanting is also connected with having some sort of understanding, some sort of cognition of the world. Even though, despite this, Kant insists that the three faculties of the mind are distinguished from one another, and you can't say that they are rooted in another. They really are three different faculties. Those three faculties were already known to the Leibniz-wolffian school, but here they tried to find a common principle behind all of them. So Wolff would speak of the faculty of representation, and he would say that not just our cognitions, but also our feelings and our desires are mental representations in a way. So he would try to narrow it all down to the faculty of cognition, and to view the other two as extensions of the faculty of cognition. And Kant does applaud him for the attempt, and he says that the attempt speaks of true philosophical spirit, because philosophy should try to deduce everything from one single principle and to always go back to one single principle. Philosophy should not be content with there being three different faculties of our mind. I will talk in later lectures about the why, because Kant will say that reason is the faculty of principles. He will say that that is what rationality does, trying to come back to one first principle out of which everything else flows. But even so, despite applauding the attempt of Wolff, Kant says that Wolff failed, that you can't say that feelings or desires are just a form of cognition. Kant says that maybe those three faculties are somehow connected, but we can't really find out. And so if you wonder how Kant knows that there are these three faculties and not more or less, he knows from experience. He knows from empirical psychology. He knows from examining his own psyche and finding these three faculties there. So if you go back to my lecture on what is science, I said that according to Kant, distinctions are either logical distinctions, and those work according to the principle of contradiction. So those are always dichotomies, always splitting a concept into two things, A and non-A, or they are empirical distinctions. And when you have an empirical division, you have a polytomy. So you can have more than two parts. So if you watched that lecture and still remembered it and paid attention here, then you will probably have realized that this cannot be a logical distinction, because we have three faculties according to Kant, not just two faculties of the mind. So therefore, this is an empirical distinction. I might add that Fichte would later manage to base all three faculties on one principle, and he would not, like Wolff, try to base it on the theoretical, so to base the feeling and the desiring on the cognition, but rather he would base it all on the practical. So he would base the cognition and the feeling on the desiring. He would go on to show that everything, including our cognition, including our logical judgments, is an extension of our wanting, of our will. Kant could not yet find that, because ultimately his inquiry is not into our thinking itself, but it is into our thinking of objects. How do we think objects? But this is a gap in Kant's philosophy, because since he only found these three faculties empirically, according to his own thinking, this is not fully scientific, and we can't be completely sure if maybe there's a fourth faculty in our mind that Kant just overlooked. But as I said, this gap is later closed by Fichte, so it's not a big problem. But if we only look at Kant, it is a gap. Anyways, Kant now says that we, as humans, we are both sensual and intellectual beings. And that means that each of these three faculties of our mind can be separated into two parts. A lower faculty, that is the sensual one, and a higher faculty, that is the intellectual one. And Kant stresses that when he calls them lower and higher, this is not a judgment on their value. In fact, he will show that the sensuality is extremely important and that we can't really think without sensuality giving us material to think with. But still, the intellectual faculties, they are the reigning ones. They are the government, so to say, in our mind, because they are ordering and forming the material that the senses give us, and therefore he calls them the higher faculties. So when we go through each of the three faculties, starting with the faculty of cognition, the lower faculty of cognition, the sensual one, would be, for example, in our five senses. So when I see something, when I taste something, when I smell something, that is obviously sensual, because here I'm receptive, I'm passive. As I said before, I can't really help myself. If I have, for example, something salty in my mouth, I have to taste salt. If I have something sweet in my mouth, I have to taste sweetness, whether I like to or not. I just receive sensations here. And then the higher faculty of cognition is what Kant calls our thinking faculty or our intellect. Here I am coming up with concepts, with ideas, with judgments, and here I am spontaneous. Here I am active, not just passive. When it comes to the feeling, the lower faculty of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure is, well, the faculty of the pleasurable. So when I enjoy food, or when I enjoy a comfortable seat, or when I enjoy sex or whatever, here I am passive. To be clear, passive doesn't mean that I don't move. When I eat, I probably am active insofar as I move the food into my mouth. And when I have sex, I also might be very active. But insofar as I receive pleasure, that pleasure is not made by myself. I can't just cause that pleasure at will. I can't just say, now I want to experience a good taste, or now I want to experience an orgasm, but rather I have to receive that pleasure from something. I have to receive the good taste from the food actually being in my mouth, or I have to receive the orgasm from someone actually stimulating me, even if I myself stimulate myself, if I masturbate. On the other hand, Kant would say that there is a higher faculty of pleasure and displeasure. And once again, that is when I find something beautiful. That is not simply caused by the object, as sensual pleasure is, but that is caused by myself and by the way I view that object. What exactly that means, I will talk about in future lectures. And finally, the faculty of desiring. Well, the lower faculty of desiring, according to Kant, is our sensual desires, like being hungry, being sleepy, being horny. Those are desires that I don't really choose. They are caused, so to say, by nature, by my body, and I can, of course, try to suppress them, to ignore them, but as desires, they are there, they just affect me. And then I also can have an intellectual faculty of desiring, and that is my will that can be moral, because that is what morality is about. It is not a desire that comes through nature affecting me in a certain way, like when I want to eat food, but rather it is a desire that is spontaneous, that is active, that is self-caused, because I think about something rationally and I realize that things should be this and that way. I realize that I should act in a certain way, that I have a moral duty. So humans have both of these faculties. That is what is special about us. Kant also ascribes these three faculties to other living beings, but to them he ascribes only the lower or only the higher faculties. So when it comes to animals, Kant say they also have a faculty of cognition, they also have a feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and they also have a faculty of desiring, of course, but they are purely sensual. They are not intellectual beings. They can't be spontaneous. They have no freedom. So therefore, they can never be active. They are always passive. So all actions that animals take are just reactions. They only respond to things as they affect them. So they have sensual cognition. They They see, they smell, they hear. They have sensual pleasures, for example, food or sex. And they have sensual desires. They have their instincts telling them to eat, to mate, and so on. But they have, for example, no sense of morality or of beauty. They have no concepts and especially no higher ideas of God or so on. And on the other hand, Kant says we could also imagine a being of pure reason, like God. And such a being would then also have these three faculties, but only the higher faculties. So Kant would say that God, of course, has a faculty of cognition. He is all-knowing. He has a feeling of pleasure and displeasure, or rather, in his case, only pleasure, because God is existing in eternal bliss. And he has desires. He wants something. He has a will. But God has no sensuality. So God is not affected by other things, because that would limit him. God can never be passive, because then he would in some ways depend on other things, and that doesn't fit with the idea of God. God only has the higher faculties. He only has spontaneity. He only has pure activity. Everything that he knows, every pleasure, every felicity he has, and every will he has is self-caused. It's not caused by something else affecting him. I might add here that when Kant talks about beings of pure reason, it is often not so clear. I mean, it's hypothetical talk anyway to make a point. Kant is never saying that they actually exist, only that we can conceive of them in a certain way. But it is often not quite clear if Kant is saying that there's only one such being or that there could be many. And some have imagined Kant talking of many beings of pure reason, like, for example, the angels. Fichte later makes it more clear that there can only possibly be one such being. But even Kant, in some instances, is more clear about that. And if you think about it, only God can be a being of pure reason, because every being that is not God must in some ways be limited, no matter how much greater than us it might be. It can't be eternal and all-knowing and almighty, or else it would be God. And, well, the only limit there can be is when you are not active but passive, when you are not spontaneous but receptive in some way. So therefore, any being that is not God, any being that is in some way limited, must have some sort of sensuality. So if there are beings like angels, they would have to maybe have a different sensuality than we. Maybe they would have completely different, and maybe they would have finer senses, but they would still have to have some sort of senses. Well, when it comes to the critique then, a critique of sensuality is not needed. In sensuality, we get by quite fine without a previous critique. What is needed is a critique of our intellectuality. Because after all, what the critique should do for Kant is to find out whether and how far we can do metaphysics or not. And once again, metaphysics is about the supersensual, not about the sensual. What we want to find out is how far can we go with pure intellectuality without the help of our senses. So what can our intellectuality do when it's not just assessing and understanding the data of the senses, but working independently of them? And that means that the general question of the critique, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, can now be split up into three more specific questions. That is, how are synthetic logical judgments a priori possible? How are synthetic aesthetical judgments a priori possible? And how are synthetic practical judgments a priori possible? And that is exactly why the critique, the general project of the critique of pure reason, and Kant uses this name, which of course is also the name of the first of the three critiques, but he sometimes uses this name to talk about the whole project. That is why that project is split up into three books. The Critique of Pure Reason, which more correctly could be called the Critique of Pure Theoretical Reason, the Critique of Speculative Reason, deals with our faculty of cognition and with our logical judgments. The Critique of the Judgment Power deals with our feeling of pleasure and displeasure and the aesthetical judgments. And the Critique of Practical Reason deals with our faculty of desiring and with our practical judgments. So that is the overview of Kant's critical project. I want to close this off now with giving a very brief overview of Kant's answer to his critical question in all three critiques. Maybe if you don't know more about Kant yet, you won't fully understand this because it's too brief and too abstract and too general. Don't despair in that case, because I will spend the coming weeks and months talking in length and in depth about the various parts of Kant's critique and explaining each of them further. But I want to give a sort of framework for that by first giving this general overview for a sort of orientation. So Kant finds himself confronted with two opposing positions in philosophy in all three parts of the critique. One is rationalism, or more properly, we could characterize it as objective rationalism, which believes that our intellectuality can go beyond the realm of the sensual and can come up with new content, with new material. So the rationalists, and that's mainly the leibniz-wolffian school in his time, that's the philosophy that was leading in Germany. The rationalists, when it comes to the faculty of cognition, would say we have pure intellectual concepts that don't come from experience, and we can also, in our thinking, we can go beyond the realm of experience. We can have knowledge about God, we can prove the immortality of the soul, and so on. When it comes to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, they will say that beauty is about perfection. We find something beautiful when, through reason, we recognize it to be perfect. And when it comes to the faculty of desiring, and therefore when it comes to our actions and to morality, they will say that there is an objective moral law that is, I don't know, out there in space or whatever, or given by God, that we can find and recognize through our reason. That's the one side. The other position, which was prominent especially in Britain, is empiricism. And empiricism will say that everything comes from sensuality. So all our cognition is based only on experience. There are no pure intellectual concepts. We are born as a blank slate, and then our experience, so to say, writes down things, concepts onto our mind. When it comes to pleasure, there's only sensual pleasure. So something like the beautiful and the sublime is not really different in quality from the pleasurable, the agreeable. And when it comes to morality, empiricism would claim that all our actions are based on sensual desires, sensual interests. So all our action is basically egoistical and is only about acquiring happiness. And moral actions too are about happiness. Maybe it is about caring for others too in some way, having sympathy, having compassion. But still, I'm ultimately not following some objective moral law, but doing what brings the most happiness. I would say that the first position, that of rationalism, has been pretty much abandoned since the age of Aufklärung. And nowadays, in our materialistic age, it is the position of empiricism which reigns. It is the common ideology of our day. But we should note that this ideology is basically denying the intellect. It's not doing so in such explicit words, because this ideology doesn't reflect onto itself, and therefore it doesn't really understand itself clearly. But as I talked about in my lecture on how to read according to Kant, it is our task in philosophy to understand the position better than those who hold it understand themselves. And well, if we go with Kant in saying that sensuality is receptive, we are passive here, we are affected somehow, while the intellect is spontaneous, we are active here, we are doing something and creating something ourselves, then the common ideology that is also held by many natural scientists, by physicists, by biologists, by the neurologists examining our brain, the reigning ideology is that there is no such thing as the intellect. They would say that we are never spontaneous. We are always receptive. We are always affected either by things outside of us or by our own brain, but we are always affected and just reacting in a way to those affections. They will be consistent enough to also deny that there is such a thing as freedom. They will say everything we think and everything we do is just chemical processes, is just electrical currents happening in our brain according to the laws of nature. And we don't really have influence on that. So what they are doing ultimately is denying that there is such a thing as an intellect. What they are doing is saying that our thinking is really part of our sensuality. But that means denying humanity itself. That means saying that we are basically animals, maybe smarter animals, but still animals. And it means denying everything that doesn't come from experience, but from reason. It means denying the beautiful, denying morality, saying that in truth, there is no such thing. Beauty too is just regular sensual pleasure. Morality too is just selfish action, maybe smart selfish action, maybe compassionate action, but ultimately it's about my own happiness. That's what the reigning ideology is saying. And I don't want to refute it here. I mean, I will talk in upcoming lectures on Kant, I will talk more about the topic of freedom and so on. Here, I just want to point it out that Kant, his great accomplishment is to distinguish these two faculties, the intellectuality and the sensuality, and distinguish them according to principles, show that they are not different just in degree, but they are truly different in quality. And nowadays, what the current ideology is doing is saying, no, there is no such thing as intellectuality. We are never spontaneous. Well, but how does Kant respond to this opposition between objective rationalism and empiricism? He considers both of them dangerous. Objective rationalism can lead to what he calls Schwärmerei in German, that is, could be translated as enthusiasm. If you believe, so to say, that you can create new content with reason alone, with the intellect alone, then you can believe that you can create anything. If you believe that you can, with your reason, you can go beyond experience and prove things that are beyond experience, then one person can try and prove God, the other person can try and disprove God. Or someone can say, I not only can prove God, I can prove exactly what the heavens look like. I can prove that there are 9 legions of angels in heaven and so on. There's no end then. There's no limit to how far we can go. On the other hand, the danger of empiricism is skepticism. And I mean, we can see that in Britain, we had empiricism with someone like Locke, and it led to the skepticism of Hume. Because, as I discussed previously, the empirical is never necessary. We can only observe that something is the case, but not that it has to be the case and can't be otherwise. And it is never universal. Maybe it has certain generality. We can maybe observe that so far something has always been like that. But that doesn't tell us that it will always be like that there might never be an exception. So, since there is no necessity and universality, we can always doubt anything. The empiricist can say there is causality. We observed 1,000 times that when one ball hits the second ball starts rolling away. But I can, if the only proof for that is that we observed it 1,000 times, I can always say maybe the 1,001st time we won't observe it. Maybe there is no causality. Or likewise in morality, the empiricist can say, well, you should not cause suffering, you should help people in need because of compassion. Well, I can say that's what people with compassion will be compelled to do, and I can say most people maybe have compassion, but that doesn't constitute a general and necessary moral law. And when someone comes along who simply doesn't have compassion and doesn't care that he's causing suffering, I can't really reproach him. I can't really say, you should act like that, if my only argument is, well, everyone who has compassion, and most people do have compassion, would act like that. That doesn't constitute a should. So, both are wrong and both are dangerous. Rationalism leading to enthusiasm, and empiricism leading to skepticism. But here Kant employs his sympathetic method, about which I talked in a previous lecture. He doesn't just throw these two positions away altogether. He believes that both of them contain a partial truth that needs to be saved and retained. And he believes that between two opposing positions, we should try to reach a middle position, which contains both of their partial truths. And so Kant does reject empiricism. He agrees with the objective rationalists that we need, in certain cases, necessity and universality, and we cannot find them in the empirical, in experience. We can only find them through the intellect. So Kant is a rationalist, but his is not an objective, but a subjective rationalism, because he agrees with the empiricists that our intellect cannot go beyond the sensual realm, that it cannot give us new material truth. What Kant is saying ultimately is that material always comes from the senses. In all three cases, when it comes to cognition, to pleasure and displeasure, and to desiring, it is sensuality, it is receptiveness, which gives us the material, the content. So, which gives the sensations, the perceptions for experience and for cognition, which gives the feelings of pleasure and displeasure, which gives our desires, like being hungry or being sexually turned on or being sleepy or whatever. But what reason or what the intellect does do is give the form, Kant says. So it can't create material of its own, but it can give the sensual material a form. So our cognition can't just come up with a proof for God that goes beyond experience. But we do have this pure intellectual concept of causality. And when I perceive, that is the material, when I perceive one ball walling against the other and the second one walling away, my thinking gives this the form of causality. I think that there is a causal relation. And likewise, when it comes to acting and to morality, I may have sensual desires. I may want food or sex or whatever, but my intellect gives a form to that. My intellect says, yes, you may go after your sensual desires, but only within the form of lawfulness. You may only try to accomplish your sensual desires if you don't murder or steal or rape or whatever. That is what Kant is saying. The lower faculty, the sensual one, gives the material. The higher, the intellectual one, gives the form. And mere form without content is empty. So we can't use our intellectuality to go beyond the sensual realm. We have to apply this form to the sensual material. But then on the other hand, simply raw material would be chaotic and would mean nothing to us. We have to order it through the form that our intellect gives. This form is necessary. And that is Kant's subjective rationalism. That is Kant's middle position between objective rationalism and empiricism. That is basically what the three critiques and also other works of Kant are all about. Again, if that was too general, don't worry. In the upcoming lectures, I will go into more detail. I will go into the specific parts of the critiques and explain this further. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lening, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pay, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.